Okay, good morning. And you know, George Washington was not the first president of the United States. In fact, there were about 14 people that preceded him as the first president of the United States. But it's President's Month, and I'm going to talk about George, Barbados, Thomas Jefferson, and a whole bunch of other people. And some of this history you learned in school, and some of this history you got to go to Barbados to find out about George Washington, or down at the Mount Vernon residence of George Washington in Virginia. And that is the Washington Monument a few years ago in Washington, D.C., and they were doing repairs to the place. Barbados. How many of you know Barbados and its relationship to the United States, particularly with the Declaration of Independence? Anybody? Well, you do. A little bit about it. Okay. Well, if you go on cruise ships like I have, where I've spoken, and ended up in Barbados, you find out some history that they don't teach you here in the United States. Barbados was intimately involved in the English Civil War, which resulted in the defeat and execution of King Charles I in 1649, and the rise to power of Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector. The war comes to Barbados in 1651 and ends with the Charter of Barbados. Many royalists who supported King Charles went to Barbados, and they became traitors, rather than lose their heads like the king, and bought property in Barbados. The Barbadians were all considered, who came from England, traitors. Keep that in mind, because I'm going to ask you a question about George Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and all. So they were considered traitors because they fled England. And trade was halted between the island and England, and a naval fleet was dispatched to Barbados to subdue the royalist leaders. At this point, the Barbadian governor and council issued the first Declaration of Independence from England. Does that sound familiar? 1651, 125 years until 1776. Yeah, they were traitors. They were traitors in this land. The Charter of Barbados was agreed upon January 11th, 1652. Ratified. Well, they were all Englishmen, right? At a tavern in Ostins on January 17th. There were 23 articles addressing religious liberty. Article 1, free trade, taxation, and the authority of the local assembly. Does that all sound familiar around 1776? Ostins. And this is where I actually learned all this from. This is a plaque in Bridgetown, Barbados. And it said from this vantage point, you could have witnessed one of the naval theaters of the English Civil War, 1642 through 51. Sir George Askew commanded a naval blockade of the island of Barbados from his ship, the Rainbow, in Oyster Bay from October 1651 to January 1652. Askew's naval forces were sent to subdue loyal royalists led by the governor, Lord Willoughby. The stalemate ended in a treaty between the royalists and the parliamentarian factions after the final conflict in Ostins. The Charter of Barbados was signed on 11 January 1652, Mermaid Tavern in Ostins. It guaranteed Barbadian colonists their rights to land, local control of taxation, liberty of conscience, access to the courts of law, and limited free trade. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound very familiar? Anyway, the treaty. Well, the treaty. No taxes, no customs, no imports, loans, or excise shall be laid nor levy made on any of the inhabitants of this island without their consent in the General Assembly. Article 3, the Charter of Barbados, signed Mermaid Tavern, Ostins, January 17, 1652. In other words, if you're going to be taxed, we want to know about being taxed. Taxation without representation? There's a theme here, isn't there? The treaty was to ensure that Barbados accepted the authority of the English Parliament and also prevented the local taxes from being raised without local consent. And I'll read you this. It's another plaque. These are plaques all around Bridgetown. The Treaty of Ostends that was negotiated, signed at the Mermaid Tavern in Ostends in Barbados, 1652, and its concept, no taxation without representation, was the inspiration for the Boston Tea Party in 1773, subsequently included in the American Declaration of Independence. Which leads me to the next question. Did Thomas Jefferson plagiarize things? Or did he have his original thoughts? Well, that's the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. on the Potomac, which opened up in 1943, the 200th anniversary of his birth. Barbados historians think that the charter did influence the American Revolution, or the Declaration of Independence, rather, because George Washington, on his visit here in 1751, would have been acquainted with the charter. Okay, but Jefferson stole directly from George Mason. How did he find out about it? George Mason wrote the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Thomas Jefferson borrowed part of it for the opening paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence. Other parts of the Declaration came from the Charter of Barbados. Mason's declaration was adopted by the Virginia Constitutional Convention on June 12, 1776. So how did George Washington get to Barbados? And why was he in Barbados? And how did Barbados change his life? And did Jefferson actually lift things from that? There were a lot of things going around in the 1650s, and a lot of people were writing about a lot of freedom, or they were writing about freedom. And that gets incorporated into the Charter of Barbados. And some of the Barbadians ended up in Virginia, in North Carolina. So maybe Jefferson found out from them or from whatever written material was around in those days. Meanwhile, how did George Washington end up in Barbados? Well, it's a long story. That's his half-brother, Lawrence Washington. And he comes down with tuberculosis. Lawrence Washington says to his wife, they tell me to go to the tropics that it will heal the tuberculosis. Why don't you go? No can do. She's not going to go. She lost a couple kids in childbirth. They had a couple healthy kids, and she said, nope, not going to pick myself up from Colonial Williamsburg and go down to Barbados, especially if I got to spend all that time on a boat. Well, who else could go? I mean, hey, how about my half-brother, George Washington? He's 19 years old. He's 6'4". He could survive the trip. And George Washington, who was really, just a country bumpkin, never been exposed to anything, says, sure, I'll go. Well, the brothers sailed on a ship called the Success, small traveling sloop. It took 6 weeks to get there. What George Washington called the Atlantic Ocean was the fickle and merciless ocean. Notice he spelled merciless with an I instead of an E at the end. So here they are. They're heading down to the tropics, hopefully for Lawrence Washington to get better. And they do end up in a place called Carlisle Bay. They didn't see the sign, but here are some of the problems that they faced landing in Barbados. It's surrounded by a 200-meter deep shelf located about 2 to 3 kilometers offshore. However, the reefs are a problem. Barrier reefs, patch reefs, fringing reefs. Coral reefs take thousands of years and trillions of polyps to develop, and this is what they are sailing into. So they're leaving the ocean, which is bouncing around. And by the way, today, if they would have gone to Hampton or Newport News or Norfolk to leave to get to Barbados in a cruise ship, it would take them 2.5 days. It took them 6 weeks. George Washington was very meticulous on this trip. He recorded information about the weather, details about the sailing, or the fish they caught or tried to catch. These included dolphin, pilotfish, shark, barracudas, tigerfish. On November 2nd, 1751, the Washingtons docked in Bridgetown. They went to a house that's still there, owned by Lawrence Washington's uncle, Gedney Clark, who was a slave dealer. Barbados was heavy in the slave trades. But, yeah.
Was Barbados a possession?
Yeah, Britain at the time, yeah. So he gets there, and Gedney Clark knows everybody. Again, he's in a position where he knows everybody there, being a slave trader. So he's an uncle of Lawrence Washington, says, yeah, come to my house, and they went. Now, George Washington expressed some reluctance because Mrs. Clark had smallpox. He didn't want to get smallpox. Guess what happened to him within 2 weeks? He got smallpox. So anyway, here is Barbados, and this is the port in Bridgetown, and over here now is the Barbadian Navy. That's where they are. That's where they keep their ships. So Jeffrey Clark, or rather Gedney Clark, has them over there. And a little background about Barbados. The English settled the island in 1627. They're not doing anything with it for about 2 decades. Sugar became king, so was slavery, slave trade. Barbados was one of Britain's most precious colonial possessions. Bridgetown was one of the most popular cities in British America. That's what it was in those days, British America. And there are warships. And I keep showing the warships because they become highly important in his day to George Washington. Examining the island's defenses, George Washington concluded Barbados was one entire fortification. While in Barbados he explored the economics of sugarcane, the role of Barbados in the Atlantic economy. Additionally, he explored the forts and the military structures of the island. And he becomes totally fascinated by this. He thinks it's great. And there's one of the walls that's around the entire fortress of Barbados. Somebody dropped a cannon there. So anyway, Washington was ahead. That's what he was. And all of a sudden, he's going to the big city, Bridgetown, and he's able to make contact with influential people that he would later on in his career befriend, and they would help him much later on in his career. The young Washington dined frequently at Clark's Bridgetown home. He met colonial officers, judges, merchants, military officers, and planters. He stayed in Barbados for a total of 7 weeks. Those 7 weeks not only changed his life, but changed the course of history in North America. Time to say goodbye to Barbados, and that was Barbados back in the day. You can see how highly populated it was, right? The 6-week journey home was miserable. The novelty of sea travel was gone. The weather was bad. George Washington was alone. It was the only time he left the North American continent in his life. His sea chest was robbed during the voyage. He must have known who robbed him, but they never found the culprit. His ship industry was tossed constantly by storms. He was seasick, and he's back in Yorktown, Virginia on January 27th, 1952. After returning to Virginia, he dedicated himself to the advancement in the military more completely than any of his Virginia contemporaries. Lawrence Washington did come back to Virginia, and he would die of tuberculosis in July 1752. But George is smitten. That military life, that's for me. That's what I'm going to be. George never went to a posh school in England like other rich American colonists. They were Southern colonists, British Southern colonists at the time. And he never left Virginia. And he sees a whole new world out there. And he decides he's going to become wants a commission in the British military establishment. An ambition that was probably prompted undoubtedly by his experience in Barbados. And there is George Washington. And by December 1952, he was made the commander of the Virginia militia, 20 years old. He has no previous military experience. He would see action in the French and Indian War, a war that he helped spark, and was eventually put in charge of all of Virginia's militia forces. 1753, he's 21 years old, and the Brits have their eye on him. They think he's going to be somebody special. So he was sent as an ambassador from the British Crown to French officials and Indians as far north as present-day Erie, Pennsylvania. In 1754, he was to assist in the construction of a fort at present-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. There's a mountain, right? I guess it's a hill. They call it a mountain that looks right down at the Golden Triangle in Pittsburgh called Mount Washington. Hey, by the way, George Washington, he's what country is he a citizen of in 1753?
England.
England. England. The spark. Well, George Washington accidentally starts the French and Indian War. Did you know that about him? He accidentally starts. 1754, Washington's surprise attack upon a small French force at Jumonville Glen and the subsequent surrender to French forces at the Battle of Fort Necessity helped spark the French and Indian War, which is part of an imperial conflict, global conflict, between Great Britain and France, also known as the 7 Years' War. The French responded by attacking the fortifications Washington erected following the ambush, forcing his surrender. He's released on parole. He and his troops go back to Virginia. And George Washington starts rethinking his role in the military, the French-Indian War. You know what? He says, going home, going to become a surveyor. But he still has the itch. He wants to get back in the military. And he wants to do it for the English, his home country. And so he's in the middle, again, of the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, in 1756. In the first year of his command of the Virginia Regiment, Washington shaped the unit into one of the best provincial military units in the colonies. He was a rigorous disciplinarian. And if you crossed him, he had no problems giving you the lash. And if you deserted, he captures you, has no problems hanging you. But he does have a problem with this guy. The guy's name is Robert Dinwiddie, and he is the governor of Virginia. Now, George Washington wasn't the greatest in terms of strategy on the battlefield. He left a lot to be desired. He was good with his men. His men loved him. But in terms of strategy, not so much. He comes back after battlefield losses, gets into fights with Dinwiddie, and says, you know what? I'm going back to Williamsburg. Going to see what life has for me. I'm going to resign from the Virginia militia. With that could have been the end of George Washington. Because, especially because he ran into her, Martha Dandridge Custis. She was a wealthy widow. One thing George Washington apparently liked was money. And she was perfect for him. He decided to become the stepfather of her kids. She had money, money, money. And he decides, after marrying her on January 6, 1759, I'll become a politician, which he does, and a farmer. He's in the Virginia House of Burgesses, and for 16 years, between 1759 and 1775, George Washington lives the quiet life of plantation owner and politician. And there's nothing remarkable about his days as a politician either. Quebec City. How many of you have been up to Quebec City? Anybody? Okay. When my son was about, I guess he was 8 or 9 years old, we're in Quebec City. I'm covering sports. I'm covering the National Hockey League draft. And I knew a guy who played with the New York Rangers by the name of Anders Hedberg, who was a Toronto Maple Leaf scout at the time. And my son was upset about something, and Anders said to me, you don't mind if I walk with him, maybe I'll calm him down. I said, no, go ahead, go ahead. And he starts walking a couple feet, and I hear him say to my son, see this land out here? This land is where North American history changed. There's so much history there. And he calmed my son down, And Anders Hedberg knew about it. He played in Winnipeg, and they'd go to Quebec City to play games 7 times a year over about a 5-year period. So he knew all about the history of Quebec City. And it is true. History changes in Quebec City. And this is a monument in the Plains of Abraham. O Canada, this glorious national anthem verse by Sir Adolphe Routier. Music by Kalina Laval was the first sung at the first Congress, and then it's in French on June 24th, 1880. It's where history changes, at least Northern history and East Coast history. There's the fortress around Quebec City. The French didn't build a complete fortress around Quebec City. It stops because there is a cliff there. And they figured, the English, they're never going to come up the cliff. It's too steep, too much, they're not going to do it. This is fine, we'll leave it there. Wrong. 15-minute battle, Plains of Abraham. Montcalm, Marquis de Montcalm from France, defeated here, received his mortal wounds, 15 September 1759. Defeated by General James Wolfe of England. England takes over what is now Quebec, or Eastern Canada. And there's other things going on as well. Quebec City there, and I told you how the English came up there. But east of Quebec is Nova Scotia. Anybody been to Nova Scotia? Been to Nova Scotia. Well, Nova Scotia is kind of interesting because the French colonists, that's where they first went and established the first permanent European settlement in future Canada, and the first north of Florida at Port Royal. And it would eventually become Acadia. They built this fort in Louisbourg. That's a replica of the fort that's up there now near Sydney, Nova Scotia. Louisbourg was built, or was a settlement, in 1713. 1730, they built the biggest military fortress in the world. It fell to the English in 1758. The 1713 Treaty of Utrecht gave Cape Breton and Prince Edward Island to the French. How many of you read Evangeline? Longfellow Evangeline. You must have read it in school because it was required reading in school for me in the 1960s anyway. And it's the story about Evangeline and the expulsion of the French from Nova Scotia. And they would leave Nova Scotia and go throughout the world. And it is ethnic cleansing. You can't get around it. It's ethnic cleansing. And Halifax remembers the ethnic cleansing and where some of the people went. They went to down here, Louisiana, and became Cajuns. And that's how America has Cajun culture. French and Indian War is over. War in which England finally defeated the French in what is now Canada, the Mississippi, the Great Lakes line. The English took Canada. Okay, it's over, right? Yeah. Nothing's going on, right? Go ahead and live your lives as colonists. George Washington despised the life of a colonist. He's back home. He never gets the commission in the English Army, despite being the commander-in-chief of all forces in defense of Her Majesty's colony in Virginia. Becomes a politician. You know, missed all the action. He missed all of the action. The war is done, but tensions between the English colonists, the southern English colonists, the ones from Massachusetts, where Maine is now, south to Georgia, they're rising. Treaty of Paris is in 1763. That ends the war. And it's the first time Great Britain is not engaged in a war with any country in 50 years. So the Parliament's got to pay for this war, right? You got to pay for all these wars. Where do we go? And you know what? There's some rich people, really rich people, particularly in the southern colonies. You know what? Why don't we start taxing them to pay for the war? So this enormous debt has to be taken care of. And you got John Hancock. Yeah, there are a lot of rich people in the colonies. We'll get there. We'll soak them. Okay, in the South, the southern colonies, know what's going on in the northern colonies, or British North America. The South is the Massachusetts colony, which is, as I said, Maine, which was across from what is now New Brunswick, but was Nova Scotia. They knew in the South, England won in Quebec and chased the French from Nova Scotia. So what's next? What's next? Proclamation of 1763 is next, and people were not happy with the proclamation. Parliament issues the proclamation of 1763 prohibiting settlement in American colonies west of the Appalachians. The proclamation is greatly resented in Virginia. Especially one guy really can't stand it. His name is George Washington. Patrick Henry was in Virginia as well. Parliament imposes the Stamp Act for taxing the American colonies. Now remember, the colonies are literally 13 different nations, not really strung together all that well. Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. Patrick Henry introduces the Stamp Act, resolves in the Virginia House of Burgesses, where Washington is. These resolves challenge Great Britain's right to impose tax. Well, in Barbados, Great Britain had to deal with locals if they wanted to impose a tax or raise a tax. Not so with the American colonists. They wanted their money. Parliament in 1776 repeals the Stamp Act but places the Declaratory Act, which asserts Great Britain's right to pass any laws governing the American colonies. And people are getting more and more upset. Parliament imposes the Townshend duties, taxing imports of tea, glass, paper, lead, and paint in the American colonies. Hey, how many of you put your John Hancock on something? Now, today, kids don't know that expression, give me your John Hancock. So everybody knows what give me your John Hancock is. That's your John Hancock, the biggest signature on the Declaration of Independence. John Hancock was a Boston businessman, said to be the richest guy in the Southern Territories, or Southern colonies. Hancock came into direct conflict with the British in 1768 when one of his merchant ships, the Liberty, was seized in Boston Harbor by British custom officials who claimed that Hancock had illegally unloaded cargo without paying the required taxes. Hancock was a very popular figure in Boston, and the seizure of his ship led to angry protests by local residents. In the ensuing months and years, Hancock became increasingly involved in the movement for American independence. Massachusetts was at the center of the movement, and Boston in particular was dubbed the cradle of liberty. Meanwhile, George Washington is also a businessman. He's running that plantation. There he is with two kids and Martha. And by the late 1760s, George Washington says, it's time to go. He experienced firsthand the effects of rising taxes imposed on American colonists by the British. He came to believe that, you know what, let's get out of here. So let me ask you a question. George Washington, traitor or not? Is he a traitor or is he not a traitor? Yes or no? Well, let's continue. 1767, Washington opposed the Stamp Act, Townshend Act, as the 1774 Intolerable Act. He also knew, or probably knew, that England pulled its best troops out of North America. I'm a journalist. That's my background. And here's Washington, one of his former allies, or somebody he knew during the French and Indian War, in Pittsburgh, overlooking the stadium. Hey man, I want to get out of here. What do you? You want to get out of here? You always want to be part of England? Let's start talking. Let's start talking. You know, we could do this. You could help us out. Let's get rid of the British forever. Let's go. What do you think? So he starts looking for allies. In 1773, Parliament passes the Tea Act. The Boston Tea Party takes place in Boston, Massachusetts. A party of nearly 50 men disguised as Indians, led by Samuel Adams. They board ships, opened 342 chests of tea and empties the tea into Boston Harbor. Samuel Adams is known more for this today than that, a beer. Samuel Adams Boston Lager. Oh, hey, if you're ever in Boston and you want to go throw tea into the Charles River, go to that place. They let you go on the boat, they hand you tea, you flip it into the Charles River. You could do that for, well, last time I was there 3 years ago, for $10. Seeking to boost the troubled East India Company, British Parliament adjusted import duties, while consignees in Charleston, South Carolina, New York, and Philadelphia rejected tea shipments. Merchants in Boston refused to concede to Patriot pressure. The Boston Tea Party, this is where it was organized, the Old South Meeting House. On the night of December 16, 1773, Samuel Adams led, but did not go onto the ships to protest. 60 members of the Sons of Liberty boarded the 3 ships in Boston Harbor, threw the tea overboard, and boy, did King George get upset. King George was so upset because these are his subjects, right? Because they're all Brits, right? They're his subjects. This resulted in the passage of the Punitive Coercive Acts, 1774. And they were intended to punish the colony of Massachusetts and Boston in general, because of the Tea Party and because there was a lot of resistance going on. The Coercive Acts of 1774 closed Boston Harbor until the tea lost in the Boston Tea Party was paid for. Ended the Massachusetts Constitution, ended free election of town officials, moved judicial authority to Britain and British judges, basically creating martial law in Massachusetts. It also required colonists to quarter or put up British troops on demand, extended freedom of worship to French Canadian Catholics who were there, particularly in the West, around Pittsfield, under British rule, and that angered the Protestant colonists. So, was George Washington in favor or against the Tea Party? Yes or no? You think he liked the Tea Party? Yes or no? Publicly, he says one thing. Privately, another thing. In June 1774, he wrote, "The cause of Boston will be considered as the cause of America." But his personal views of the event are far different. He voiced strong disapproval of their conduct in destroying the tea and claimed Bostonians were mad. Washington, and he was an elite, he didn't want to see this. Because even though they may not like one another politically, they were still of the same class. Private property off limits. Ben Franklin, formerly of Boston, now of Philadelphia, whose son, Richard, was the governor of New Jersey, appointed by King Charles III. He didn't like this either. He insisted the British East India Company be reimbursed for the lost tea, and even offered to pay for it himself. The Berkshires, about 2 hours away from Boston, western Massachusetts. Near this spot stood the first courthouse of Berkshire County, erected 1764. Here, August 16, 1774, occurred the first open resistance to British rule in America. Well, wait a minute. Was it in the Berkshires, or was it outside of Boston? I know things traveled slowly. News traveled slowly back in those days. There were skirmishes between the British troops and colonial militiamen in Lexington and Concord in 1775, and the Battle of Lexington and Concord fought on April 19, 1775, kicked off the American Revolutionary War. Second Continental Congress meets in 1775, and Peyton Randolph was re-elected president of the Congress. You can make a case that Peyton Randolph was the first president of the United States. You can make that case. George Washington was named commander-in-chief of the American forces. He decides, after 24 years after he saw Barbados, I want to get to fight. Hancock might have wanted that job. Meanwhile, King George III was really upset. He declared the American colonies in rebellion. Washington was ready for action. He appears in a military uniform. I'm ready, boys, let's go. He had prestige, had military experience. He had charisma. Washington. Why Washington instead of John Hancock? Well, very simply. He was in Barbados. He was shown everything about the British Armed Forces in Barbados during 7 weeks. And also, he fought for the Brits in North America. So he knew all about the strengths and weaknesses, and that would prove invaluable during the Revolution. And he had the ability to keep the struggling colonial army together. His troops were poorly trained. They lacked food, ammunition, and other supplies, sometimes no shoes in the winter, but he was able to keep them going, and going they did. That is the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, and that is the Declaration of Independence, which was actually finished before the 4th of July, 1776. But, the guys who signed this knew that if the British caught them, they would be hanged. So they decided, we'll let the town crier do it, and we're going to scatter. And the town crier read the Declaration on July 4th, 1776. So these guys knew that they were traitors. They were traitors. As president of the Continental Congress, John Hancock is credited as the first signer of the Declaration of Independence. His prominent stylish signature became famous. According to legend, Hancock boldly inscribed his name so the English king, George III, would not need glasses to read it. Today, the term John Hancock is synonymous with the signature. But the Americans, or the Continental Army, were a ragtag group. And they needed help from wherever they could find it. Like this guy, who was thrown out of the Prussian army, Baron von Steuben. Why was he tossed? He was gay. But Ben Franklin, George Washington didn't care. They needed anybody who was capable to come to America. The former Prussian army officer came to America in December 1777, helped the American cause. Drill master of Valley Forge, that's when he was known for his role in introducing European concepts of military discipline to American troops. Meanwhile, Mr. Franklin goes to France. What gets me is if you look at Ben Franklin, you would never suspect he was a ladies' man, would you? But he was, apparently. One of his quotes was, "A lady never loses her beauty from the neck down." Ben Franklin, he would have been a big star on cable TV news today. So he goes to France, says, "Hey, can you help us?" And they say, "Sure." France provided the money, troops, armament, military leadership, and naval support that tipped the balance of the military power in favor of the United States and paved the way for the Continental Army's ultimate victory. The surrender of Lord Cornwallis in Yorktown, Virginia. George III is kind of upset. He writes in his diary, "America is lost." 1781, the Americans, with assistance from the French, beat England in Yorktown, Virginia. King George III was reluctant to come to terms with his army's defeat in the Battle of Yorktown, 1781. He even drafted an abdication speech. But in the event, he said, okay, let the negotiators figure it out, because you know what? It's good to be the king. It's good to be the king. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris recognized the United States and he ceded Florida, territory of Florida, to Spain. So Washington's able to go home. After all, he hasn't seen Martha in about 4 or 5 years, and he decides, yeah, let me go back. So it's goodbye, Francis Tavern, 54 Pearl Street, corner of Broad Street, Lower Manhattan. The location played a prominent role in history before, during, and after the American Revolution. It served as the headquarters for George Washington. Why not a bar? Why not? I bet you he never picked up the tab either. A venue for peace negotiations with the British and eventually housing federal officers in the early days of the Republic. After British troops evacuated New York on November 25th, the tavern hosted a week later an elaborate turtle feast dinner on December 4th, 1783, in the building's long room for U.S. General George Washington, where he says, goodbye, You're never going to see me again. He's gone. Well, the tavern becomes the seat of government. Why not? Why not have a tavern as a seat of government, right? Today it's still a bar. The bar's still there, a museum. So George finally decides maybe it's time I go into retirement. After all, I'm in my 50s, and people in those days didn't live that old. So yeah, let me, I'm done. I'll go back, I'll see Martha. Kids have grown up. I got my slaves, I got my plantation. I'm going to work on the plantation. But people said, George, we need you. We need you. Don't run away. We need you. He's reluctant, but he goes to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. He's a delegate from Virginia, and he's elected president of the convention, the last president of the convention. He held considerable criticism of the Articles of Confederation of the 13 colonies for the weak central government and established and referred to the Articles as no more than a rope of sand to support the new nation. And he felt that you needed a strong federal government. And why was that? Couldn't get money from anywhere for the Continental Army, and they needed to supply money to the military. Like I said, George Washington was the last president of the convention. The first president was a guy by the name of Huntington, Samuel Huntington. Washington was actually the first president under the U.S. Constitution. Prior to the ratification of the Constitution in 1788, the United States was governed by the Articles of Confederation. The Articles constituted the supreme law of the land from 1781 through 1789. There were 9 presidents, starting with Samuel Huntington, who served as the president of the Continental Congress from 1779 to 1781, and the president of the United States in Congress assembled in 1781. That's a guy named John Hanson, who was considered a president. So George Washington may or may not be, depending on your real strict view of history, the first president of the United States. That's Federal Hall in Lower Manhattan. That's where he was inaugurated. And as president, he created the executive and judicial branches. He approved all of the high-ranking officials in jobs, and because of him, numerous political practices were established. He also had this guy. See, I'm showing you Hamilton for nothing here. I mean, we paid outrageous prices to see Hamilton. You did. And you get to see him for nothing here. And you get to hear me perform Hamilton for nothing here. Washington supported Alexander Hamilton's economic policies, whereby the federal government assumed the debts of state governments. Hamilton established the first bank of the United States, the United States Mint, and the United States Customs Service. And if you want to see Hamilton for nothing, go to Lower Manhattan, you can see Hamilton for nothing. Meanwhile, Washington is in retirement. What's his job in retirement? Well, he's busy, he's management of the plantation in Mount Vernon, made up of 5 farms, 8,000 acres with a grist mill and a distillery, a fishery, the manor house, gardens, scores of outbuildings, several hundred slaves. Yeah, he's there, and there is a concern. Hey, we think France is about ready to go to war with us. Let's get George, the President John Adams, Alexander Hamilton say to Washington, come to see us. You need to see us. And we got to save the country from the French. I don't know. I'm 57 years old. I don't know. I'm 67 years old. Do I need this anymore? Well, apparently he did. He didn't think the French would invade, but he's coming out of retirement again. It's November 1798. Washington met in Philadelphia with 2 major generals, Alexander Hamilton and Charles Cotesworth, Pinckney of South Carolina. And they are going to put together the army that Washington feels is needed in the United States, and they're going to choose the officers to head up the army. So they're there for 6 weeks. And Philadelphia could be hot in the summer in 6 weeks, right? And they made their recommendations in a series of reports to the Secretary of War, but nothing happened. Well, Washington goes back in retirement. And like many retired politicians, he becomes a partisan hack. Him in newspapers. Today it would have been on cable TV news. He becomes a partisan hack, pushing his candidates for Congress, complaining about people. He died in 1799. It ain't over until it's over, said the guy who I used to speak at his museum, Yogi Berra. England would want revenge, and another war was brewing. But the United States was also itching for a war. It's called the War of 1812. In June 1812, the United States declared war on Great Britain in reaction to three issues: the British economic blockade of France, the impressment of thousands of neutral American seamen into the British Royal Navy against their will, and the British support of hostile Indian tribes along the Great Lakes frontier. Burn down the White House. The Brits burnt down the White House in 1814, a place that neither George Washington nor John Adams ever saw. A faction of U.S. Congress made up of Western is Tennessee, and Southern is Georgia, had been advocating for a declaration of war against the Brits for years. The 36-year-old United States declared war on Britain because of the interference of merchant ships that enforced enlistment into the Royal Navy. There was a plan by the United States: conquer what is now known as Canada. Take North America, all of North America, to the Mexico border, and make it ours. It never happened. This guy is a hero in Canada. His name is Major General Robert Ross, and he burnt down the White House. In 1814, Washington, D.C. fell to the British in August. In Washington, Ross's British troops burned the White House, the Capitol, and other buildings in retaliation for earlier burning of government buildings in Canada, or what became Canada, near Toronto. Fort William McKendree. It's got a special place in American history because notice the flag unfurling there? The British would retreat after the Battle of Fort William McKendree in Baltimore's harbor. And that fort withstood a massive British bombardment and inspired Francis Scott Key to write the poem Star Spangled Banner, which became the national anthem in 1931. On September 11, 1814, the tide of war turned when the American naval force under Thomas MacDonough won a decisive victory at the Battle of Plattsburgh in New York on Lake Champlain. A large British army under Sir George Prevost was forced to abandon its invasion of the U.S. Northeast and retreat to Canada. Why aren't we Canadians? Why aren't we Canadians? This is a cemetery in Halifax where General Ross is laid to rest. Ross is a big name in Canadian history, even though the country didn't exist until 1867. Why are Canadians not Americans? Because of Ross, who defended Canada, except there was no Canada during the War of 1812. Albert Gallatin was the U.S. envoy that ended up negotiating the deal, Treaty of Ghent. December 24th, 1814, the treaty is signed. Back to 1812 borders. Britain gives up American land near the border of the Great Lakes. The U.S. gives up Ontario and says to Spain, you want Florida? Here it is. It's yours. President James Madison signs the agreement on February 17, 1815. Except nobody told this guy that the war was over. Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson. Old Hickory said we could take him by surprise. News of the treaty took almost 2 months to cross the Atlantic, and British forces were not informed of the end of hostilities in time to end their drive against the mouth of the Mississippi. On January 8, 1815, a large British army attacked New Orleans and was decimated by an inferior American force under General Andrew Jackson in the most spectacular U.S. victory of the war. But the war was over when this took place. But, you know what? Something good happened out of it. Remember Johnny Horton, the singer? He had a big hit in 1959 called The Battle of New Orleans. In 1814, we took a little trip. Remember that song? took a little trip down the mighty Mississippi. It's a big hit for Johnny Horton. Declaration of Independence. Every 4th of July, that building in Boston, somebody comes out and reads the Declaration of Independence to a crowd that's standing there. Well, it's July 4th, 1976, and let's let bygones be bygones, right? The Queen Elizabeth, spent July 4th, 1776 in Boston, celebrating the Declaration of Independence 200th anniversary. Gerald Ford and Queen Elizabeth II toasted one another in Washington a few days later. Shall we dance? We know it's the Queen because she's wearing a tiara. Shall we dance? Is that Fred Astaire? Shall we dance? A toast. A toast. Oh, there's the Queen with her tiara and Gerald Ford and Nelson Rockefeller here too. I'm glad you asked that question. Nelson Rockefeller, who was the Vice President of the United States. Shall we dance? Gerald Ford, the President of the United States, and Queen Elizabeth II toasted one another in Washington, and they danced. Thank you so much. Any questions, any comments?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Ask a question or give your comment. Anybody?